Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. So if the title alone of this show hasn't told you enough, I have long been curious about the realms of plant medicine, how shamans work within these realms, and how to consciously and intentionally interact with these medicines in order to receive the highest quality, safest, and most effective experiences possible. This quest has allowed me to embark upon a truly deep, fascinating, and at times challenging journey into the teachings, philosophies, and direct experiences themselves surrounding these subjects. When I find others who are on this same quest, I find myself more often than not feeling as though we have known each other before, almost as if we are repeating and doubling down on a quest we may not have finished to our liking in a previous lifetime. Today's guest is someone who, when I was first introduced to through a mutual friend, gave me that exact feeling and allowed me to once again feel more rooted and on track in my expedition into these mystical areas of the experience we know and refer to as quote-unquote life. He is a master energy worker, a plant medicine guide, a facilitator of practices such as breathwork and meditation, and, most importantly, someone who is ever curious about life while releasing the need to quote-unquote know anything. As a result, his mind is open, his heart is steady, and his spirit is ready for whatever life gifts him within this experience of life. Within this episode, we will be diving into his experiences, what called him into the work he is currently doing, some tips for anyone curious about exploring the realm of plant medicines, and much, much more. So please join me in giving a very warm invitation to my man, Salvatore Liberti, joining us to the show. What's up, my man? How you doing?
Hey, brother. I'm so good. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, man. We got to record on Highly Optimized yesterday, and I was so excited, right? Because, of course, that show is, more focused on your journey and, like pieces of advice you have for people starting their own paths. And this one we can jump far down the rabbit hole in, right? And there was so much that I was excited to chat with you about yesterday, but I saved it for this one. And so, a really great place I like to start off is, considering especially that you came from Peru as well, that, I'm curious, when you were growing up, if psychedelics and plant medicines had the same, stigma they had in America. And if so, or if not, rather, how you integrated that into when you moved to America. And of course, you realized that, things here are, illegal and demonized in their own specific ways. And maybe they are the same in Peru. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm curious how you became open to the idea of experimenting with these medicines, considering the stigmas around them in America and potentially Peru as well.
I love that question because I think it's really important for people to understand how the pervasive propaganda that is anti-psychedelic, that is anti these medicines that truly have shown an ability to lead us down a path of consciousness and expanded awareness. And just like in America, the same thing happened in Peru. And maybe it didn't come from the same place because I was born in Lima, Peru. And Lima historically was the epicenter of Catholicism in all of South America. That was the place of rule for the Spaniards when they controlled a lot of the continent. And that's where the archbishop lives. That's where all the big churches are, the cathedrals. And so Lima as a mixed culture where the Anglo-Saxon, the white, the Spanish culture, the Catholicism from there came into South America and mixed with the current culture. Lima then became this Catholic bubble, if you will, society bubble where like there's the Lima society and then there's everything else outside in Lima. And then there's the provinces of Peru. As we know, you and I know that ayahuasca has a deep-rooted tradition in the jungles and in the mountains of Peru. And that goes back thousands of years. Though where I grew up in Lima, everything from cannabis to, I didn't even hear about mushrooms then, and LSD and ayahuasca, all of that was vilified as drugs, as it's going to melt your brain. You're going to go psychotic. It's people who do that stuff in the jungle. And that's like sort of the ayahuasca mushroom perspective. And then the cannabis perspective was like, you're a burnout, you're a loser, losers smoke cannabis and you need to be drinking coffee and working and doing all this stuff. So there was definitely that aspect of it, that stigma with it. And then when I came to the US, I was still young. I was about 9 years old. And so I didn't really kind of become present to psychedelics in that world until I was more in high school and college, though I was always curious. Me as a curious soul, a curious mind, I'm like, I need to explore these things. Like I want to know what they know. And thankfully, the first experiences that I had were recreational, though they were very fun, if though it's sometimes maybe a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. And what's so fun about that is the idea that what I choose to believe is that even the recreational times that we interact with these medicines, because I've done it too, right, are medicinal in some way, right? There's something that a deeper part of us is yearning for and calling for. And so, the whole recreational / medicinal thing, I believe is starting to kind of fade away before our very eyes, right? Because really these takeaways that we can get, especially with psychedelics, right? Like very rarely have I interacted with a psychedelic, even in the recreational sense at a music festival or something, where I haven't walked away having an expanded awareness on a certain subject, right? And, I find myself being in the same state you are, where I was always curious about these things, right? I remember when DARE came to school, which was like the weirdest program when you really think about it. It's like, hey, drugs are bad, but we have a lot of them that we can show you. It's like, that doesn't really make any sense to me, right? But I was always curious about these things. And, they were never really demonized in my household, but they weren't talked about either, right? When I would ask my parents about it, and they were like, I don't really do that stuff, right? And so I knew right off the bat, I'm like, okay, well, my parents don't really know much about them either. And so, I fell into the same patterns of like, only stoners, only burnouts, interact with cannabis and things like that, especially because of like the shows that were out at that time, like Cheech and Chong and stuff that were, painting cannabis specifically in this image of like, you just sit on the couch and you don't do anything all day when you interact with cannabis. And then when I started finding people when I was around 14 to 15, which is generally the age where I feel like people start being presented with situations in which people are interacting with medicines like cannabis, for instance, that's what I saw. Right. And, again, like what I see cannabis specifically is a mirror, right? So it will mirror anything that is already inside of you. So if you're a lazy person, it will accentuate that, right? If you're a go-getter, it will accentuate that. And one of the best ways I heard this described in a podcast I did with Matt and Maggie Spear was, when Matt first became introduced to the realm of psychedelics and started seeing like some inconsistencies in the programming he had been brought up with, right? He was raised, I believe, in a Catholic religious household and things like this. And, he started asking some questions, and he met this guy that was a psychonaut, and was successful. And the thing the guy said to him was so funny. It was, oh, you're still in the world of muggles where you think that only people that are burnouts interact with psychedelics. So like, let me tell you something, man. If you see the truly successful people, not just financially, but like truly happy, fulfilled people, more often than not, they're interacting with psychedelics in some manner. And so, it's interesting how, over time, that curiosity led us to some sort of faith in the process of what psychedelic medicines can bring about. Because let's face it, there are so many amazing things that psychedelics can bring out. They can also bring out a lot of traumatizing things, right? But they are simply a tool. What we choose to do with that tool is actually coming from us, right? Our programming, our conditioning, right? And so a lot of times this vilification of these things is just a projection of how other people think that they would interact with them. And really, it's like, don't put that energy on me, right? Like at the end of the day, the only reason these things are vilified is because of people's fears of what could happen, right? But again, like that's simply a projection is how I choose to look at it.
Sure. And those fears are fed by the propaganda from the government, by government agencies. As I'm sure your listeners are well aware, and you are well aware of the history of psychedelics throughout the 50s and the 60s, and how that created the war on drugs. And even today, I think a lot of people group drugs all together, right? It's like, oh, drugs are bad, right? But no, there's actually a big distinction within that, right? Because there are your medicines, there are your psychedelic medicines, right? Your psilocybin, your mescaline, your ayahuasca, the DMTs, the cannabis, and then there's opiates, there's amphetamines. And as we see now, it's like, oh, like we group everything together. That just it's so simplified and so silly. We need more nuance. We need more understanding and more education. And that's what I'm really big on as well. Like understanding how someone formed the beliefs around these substances that they did, and kind of examining that and uprooting that and saying, hey, like, you are welcome to have a fresh perspective, your own ideas that come from maybe experiential learning, or learning from someone that is there to tell you the truth, there to just share with you, not try to influence your behavior or your way of thinking in some ways. So I think that we're seeing a really beautiful renaissance of these substances, and a deeper understanding on how they can help humanity move through this, you call it a pandemic of mental health, maybe.
Yes. Yeah. And really, it's like, what is even deeper than that? What I've noticed is that, really, like, and you can draw the similarity here with what psychedelics open up the potential for, is this reestablishing of personal power, right? Like this idea that you get to choose in your life what you want in your life, period, right? And so I think this is such a great framework with psychedelics to be able to get people, curious and open to the idea of like, hey, if you were programmed to think that these medicines were drugs, right? And really that, they were only for certain types of people, that were the outcasts of society and these types of things. And now you're realizing that, hey, maybe that wasn't lined up with your core values and the way you perceive life. Then what else is in there waiting to be alchemized into something that actually serves you in your life? And I think that's one of the best, like, underlying gifts. You could call it kind of like the secret within this stuff, is that, what I found in my own journey is that as I started to question my views around things like psychedelics, which is one of the first big, like, aha moments, like, call it dark night of the soul or a light night of the soul, if you will, that was what started to happen. It was, I was like, well, now I'm going to start questioning everything. And it just so happens psychedelics also double down on that, right? Like when you interact with a psychedelic, you leave often with more questions than answers. And it's not like this anxiety type thing normally of like, oh my God, I don't know anything. But it also could be that, right? If you're attached to the identity of being the knower, right? And so, really it starts breaking apart the confines of this closed-mindedness that I feel is really like the true pandemic of this society that we're going through right now and witnessing, is that people are so attached and white knuckling what their identity is, right? What they do for work, right? Who they are, right? All of these things. And really it's a gift in disguise, right? And, as Paul Chek says, great spirits down for whatever, right? So, if you want to go through your life living control and that's it feels right for you, then you have the full autonomy to do that. But at the same time, I imagine for me and you, and I imagine for anyone listening to this podcast, we're on this network because we're starting to realize that at some point, or maybe we're fully realizing at this point, that control did not do us any good. And so what's the other side of that control? Surrender.
I love that, because it reminds me of a conversation that I had recently with a friend who very vulnerably posted on this support group on Facebook. And she shared, I am experiencing depression. I've never experienced depression to this degree. I don't know where to look. I don't like, and it's one of those personal development groups, Tony Robbins. And she was like, none of this stuff that we preach in here, like, is helping me. Like, none of this, like, change your state, like, freaking rechange your mindset and reframe it, or therapy or anything like that. And she's a good friend of mine. And I saw her post publicly, and I reached out to her and I said, hey, well, would you please tell me a little bit more about what you're experiencing? And then I presented to her the idea of, I was like, I'm going to present something maybe a bit radical here, but if you're open to hearing it, I would love to share it. She said, yeah, absolutely. Please. I'm desperate at this point. And I said, well, have you ever considered psilocybin mushrooms as a therapeutic for depression? And she said, oh, I'm too scared. I'm too scared of what might come up. And that is something that I've heard multiple times in the past of people, and specifically saying like, no, it's not the propaganda of like, you might go crazy. That's not it. Well, maybe it is some of that, though. They're genuinely scared of what might come up when they take the psychedelic. Like the fact that we don't have the perspective or the education or the awareness enough that nothing within us can actually hurt us physically or actually hurt us, then that surrender can begin, though. That fear of what might be inside is, I think, what's keeping a lot of people from trying and experiencing these medicines. And it's really interesting because, man, it's like they don't think that they're mentally stable enough to go through this experience. And that's the exact reason why they may need it. And they ought to experience it, because that'll give them that awareness. That'll shake loose their means of control. And to be honest with you, Ryan, that letting go of control, that surrender, that happens every time I go into a ceremony. Every time before I take a psychedelic, my little ego is like, oh no, like really liking where we're at right now. We don't want to lose control again. Yeah. And I could have been doing, at one point I was sitting with ayahuasca every single weekend. And before every single ceremony, there was a nervousness. There was like, oh no, we're going to let go again. We're going to surrender again. And so it's okay. It's as long as you're looking at that fear and using it as a compass and as a waypoint to say, this is where I must lean in. Because on the other side of this very temporary, superficial thing known as fear, there is absolute bliss and liberation.
And you know what I love about that? Like training the idea of fear is such a cool idea, because really anything that's going to allow us to grow, whether it's a new job, whether it's a new partner, whether it's, buying a new car, I mean, literally as material as you can get, there's going to be an element of fear there, right? And so if you allow fear to run your life, how you do anything is how you do everything, right? And so you can slowly start to train that, like, hey, it's okay to feel fear, right? That's my humanness, right? We're human beings. We have the form and the formless drawn into one. And so allow yourself to be human and realizing, like, yeah, there is a degree of fear when you're going to let go of your perceived notion of reality, right? But at the same time, as Terence McKenna says, it's by hurling yourself into the abyss and finding the feather bed on the other side that you start to be able to come back into faith, right? What brings you past fear is realizing that there's something deeper that is your faith, right? And, I love what you illustrated there about, these self-help groups, because I go through this a lot too. And I'm always at this point where, I see people posting like this, especially in like coaching groups and things like that. And everyone's like NLP and all these things that are essentially more doing, right? They're more doing. And really the remedy that actually these people are looking for is less doing and more being, right? Like they're putting this pressure on themselves to figure it out, right? To figure out what their depression is. And you don't put more cars in the traffic jam to solve a traffic jam, right? It's a subtraction process that actually brings you to that goal. And, I'm curious, why are people so scared about what's inside, and why do they think it hurts them, right? I'm curious, and I have no answer on this, but I'm curious to hear your perspective. I'm curious if it has something to do with the fact that they've been conditioned through their parents and through society that, like, even if someone hasn't necessarily told them, like, oh, I run from what I fear, right? It's not like someone has consciously said that, but let's think about one of the biggest substances that's socially acceptable in our society, alcohol. Right? Exactly. And so what does that do, right? People see people come home from work and they drink a beer, right? And this is no judgment on people that drink alcohol, right? It's just a observation of, I'm curious if maybe people like your friend are feeling this, like, I don't know what's going to come up, because they've seen people run from their fears their whole life. And so that's like what's normal to them. And maybe like the complete opposite side of normal is actually handling that, right? I'm just curious. Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
What a disservice that the media and marketing does. Like we're watching TV and you see it's Miller time, Bud Light, tequila, whatever, Jack Daniels. And it's like, you guys are promoting the brain killer, the lowest vibration substance you can possibly find around here. And that's the one thing that's being promoted and celebrated. And in every show you see, oh, at the end of the day, I got to go home and have a drink. Oh, you want to have a drink? Let's go get a drink. Let's go get a drink. Oh, let's have a drink. And it's like, what are we doing? We're numbing ourselves. We're killing ourselves. And that's what it is. People numbing themselves, running away from their past, their traumas, acting out sometimes when they're drunk. And that can be dangerous and violent and hurt other people and hurt people in their lives. And it's time to stop. It's time to take a good look and face ourselves. And I think we talked about yesterday, this pandemic was a really good opportunity to people. There's no bars open. There's no friend groups out. There's no shows. There's none of this. Sit at home with yourself. Fortunately, what we saw was a spike in alcohol sales at the beginning of the pandemic, but that was bound to happen because people were locked in. Yeah, no, it's really interesting and fascinating how when you are taking a psychedelic or a substance and you might be in an environment that not everybody's on it, you're able to notice the behaviors and some of the reasons why people are acting in some ways. And if you know basic psychology concepts, psychoanalysis, NLP, you start to hear things. You're like, what the heck?
Yes. And dude, like I wanted to also mention, like you were talking about the media, right? And the way they portray alcohol is hilarious, right? Because if you've ever been around any like club, concert, like, bar environment, it's never like four people that are walking straight that are like, yeah, like it's like those shows where you have like a bunch of businessmen like drinking scotch at like 10 a.m. It's like, how is the next scene of that not them sleeping, right? Like, the way they portray alcohol, it's like if they took cannabis and portrayed it as being steroids, right? Like, oh, I smoke cannabis and my muscles get bigger. That's how ridiculous the portrayal of alcohol is. So not only is it a suppressant, a depressant, and also something that ultimately hides you from yourself, but also the way they're portraying it is something that it's not, right? It'd be one thing if they were like portraying people stumbling around and potentially having fun, right? That's a potential, right? But the way they're portraying it is people completely sound of mind, completely well-dressed, in like beach environments. It's like so corny. It's ridiculous. And, it's so funny that psychedelics, on the other hand, are portrayed as this thing where, you lose your mind, where if you've ever been part of a ceremony, like there's a lot of structure there, right? There's a lot of safety precautions taken. If you're with any good medicine guide or shaman, there's a lot of like work done, right? Where, a shaman is sitting with someone saying, hey, like, how are things going for you? What's coming up? What's your intention? What's your reason for being here, right? It's not just like, hey, we're throwing mushrooms at you and go figure it out. Hopefully you come back at the end of the night, right? It's like, but at the same time, that's the portrayal that the media is putting on this. And that's why I tell people, like, if you want to improve your life in one step, turn off the news. If you think you're informing yourself, right? And that's the reason you're watching, quote unquote, the news, you're giving yourself a horrible, like, medicine, if you want to call it that, because at the end of the day, it's a big world. Anything is going on, right? So if you're like, well, I have to stay informed on what though, right? Like the way the news goes, I can sum up every like episode of news, if you want to call it an episode, that I've ever seen. It's like, is there anthrax in your mail? Are you going to get bombed tomorrow? Are your kids safe? Hey, look at a picture of a puppy in a little tiny swimsuit. Isn't that hilarious? Oh my God. All right, be back at 9 because you got to figure out this anthrax in your mail.
And here's the weather.
Yes, exactly. Which is mostly wrong anyway. Yeah, man.
No, it's so good. It's so good. And you know what? Actually, in college, I once took a class called propaganda. And what we studied in propaganda was Hitler's Mein Kampf. And that sort of mid-century propaganda, how the rise of it was really powerful and the kind of action that it incited. We all are very aware of it. The US didn't just say, oh, look what they did. They said, look what they did. How can we do that? Yeah. They learned from it. They're really good at it. There's a reason why I grew up doing the freaking Pledge of Allegiance and national anthem every morning in public school. Like, what the heck's that about?
Yeah. So
everything from that top down, it's all about molding you to think a certain way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against alcohol in any way. I'm Italian, I'm Peruvian. I enjoy a glass of wine with a nice pasta dinner. That's perfectly fine. I have maybe a glass of wine once every 2 months, but that's okay. And I do it with intention. I do it knowing that that's going to be it. Though the one thing I did want to mention was being from Peru, being from a country where the drinking age is 18, not 21, I'm able to see a stark difference in how alcohol is treated socially. And what I mean by that is what I noticed in Peru when I went back and hung out with my friends there and we went to a party and stuff, was that people were there to see each other. And we're there to share laughs, we're there to share moments. And alcohol was present, though it was kind of on the side. Like, you go get your drink when you get your drink and you kind of hang out, and you're not binge drinking, you're not taking shots, you're not, pounding beers or doing this stuff. Though what I noticed in America is that the party revolves around the alcohol, right? Think a kegger. Why is it called the kegger? because you got to get a keg there. Think of your average clubs today in 2021, right? What is it all about? Bottles. Got to get the bottles, pop bottles, table service bottles. And it's all about the alcohol provides the fun and you just hover around and take from that. And so that is really interesting. And what's, I believe, was caused a lot of abuse of alcohol in the United States is the drinking age. You know, when you have something that's forbidden, it makes it that much more taboo and that much more like people want to do it behind closed doors and they want to do more of it. And that actually creates more binge drinking because people, I remember I did, you know, before going out, before I was 21, I would pound shots, I would pound beers because I needed to get drunk before I got to the place. And that would, and, you know, finish me up in a bush later in the night, you know, blacked out drunk in college, but I had to have that experience to learn from it. And the last thing I wanted to mention was how you were talking about earlier, the environment that is created in a medicine ceremony versus the environment where alcohol is usually present, right? What are the differences, right? In the medicine ceremony, it's all about acceptance. It's all about non-judgment. It's all about taking care of people, having precautions, everybody looking out for each other in some way. And then when there's alcohol present in a bar, it's all about who looks better than me, who's doing this, how can I go hook up with that person, how can we have more fun and get more drunk, and how can we exclude this one but include this person. It's like, wow, like it's really, really interesting to see how what kind of like societal context it creates, you know, it facilitates.
What is up, ladies and gentlemen? I wanted to stop by while I had your ear and share a very special announcement with you. You may have heard people say that we are facing an epidemic of loneliness in the world right now. We believe that this is only half of the story, and that the real epidemic and the root of feeling loneliness is a lack of connection. Do you want to connect to more purpose and passion with the important work you are doing? Do you wish you had closer friendships with people who understand you, listen to you, and are truly present with you? Are you wishing you and your partner could move deeper into love together? The connection in all of these areas comes down to the one most important element of connection, the ability to connect with yourself. If you are ready to see change in your life, if you are ready to feel differently when you wake up in the morning, if you are ready to step into the life you envision for yourself, the first and only route to making these changes is settling in, quieting down, and being able to connect to yourself. Now, this can be a major challenge in today's world with media, culture, and other energies that pull us out of our ability to connect. When you've tried fitness, meditation, and other self-development practices and still find yourself feeling alone and lacking connection, you may be feeling out of options and wondering if you'll ever be able to tap into your full potential that you know deep down is possible in your life. What we have found in working with our clients is that plant medicines, and cannabis in particular, can guide us in having the experience of what true connection looks and feels like. In this way, cannabis can act as a rite of passage for connection and a gateway toward the spouse, tribe, mission, and life you know you are ready for. Now, the pitfall here is that many people become codependent on the medicines, such as cannabis, and expect the medicine to do the work for them. If this continues, what will happen is the user will find themselves reaching for more and more cannabis to feel connection, without taking ownership of their role in the outcome of their experience, and thus they will fall into repeating the same painful patterns. As Zen Buddhism teaches, how you do anything is how you do everything. Therefore, if this painful pattern is showing up in your relationship with cannabis, it is likely a reflection of the same patterns you're experiencing in your friendships, romantic relationships, business, and your relationship with yourself. Learning to work with cannabis effectively will supercharge your experience and will help you get the result you are actually seeking, which is connection. We created a program to support seekers and high achievers like you in doing exactly this. To learn how to work with the healing power of cannabis to connect you back to yourself so you can unlock purpose, passion, and creativity in all areas of your life. What this program will give you is the long-lost user manual for cannabis. This user manual will teach you how to connect with cannabis correctly so that the plant can act as your spiritual aid and ally in life, just as our ancestors understood and practiced. If you're ready to unlock the full power of cannabis, meet like-minded people on the same path as you, build more purpose into your life, and have the most fun doing homework you've ever had, this message is for you. To learn more and qualify for your spot in the program, hop over to our Instagram profile at highly.optimized and book a discovery call. The conscious cannabis revolution is here. Will you be joining us? Sending all of you love. Enjoy the rest of the show. Yeah, that's an amazing point too, because what's also included in that? It's like, oh, well, how do I get home? Right. Well, I'm not that drunk, so I'm just going to drive home. Right. And all of these things that are so ridiculous, because at the end of the day, it's like that classic example of who do you know that smoked too much weed and gone home and beat their wife? Right. And it really it forces me to realize that if the powers that be, if you want to call them that, I hate putting people in categories, but at the same time, for the sake of conversation, if the powers that be actually gave any fucks about your health, they would look into this stuff. And that's why it smells like office supplies to me when anyone tries to bring up current things, let's just say, as if it's for your health. It's like, guys, I don't know if you've been realizing this for a long time, but I hate to be the bearer of bad news. We're just a number to them, right? And that's not necessarily like a woe is me or that the world is dark or anything. It's just like, hey, look elsewhere. Healthcare, right, to talk about one thing, is a lifestyle, right? And the way that it is in America specifically, and other Western societies too, is it's actually sick care. Oh, I'm sick. Now let me go see a doctor, right? Same with alcohol, right? Oh, alcohol's here. Now we can have a party, right? It's a reactive thing rather than a proactive experience. And with medicines, in every situation I've ever been in, right? Even if it is like going to a concert or whatever, right? People are like, hey, I've been planning for this for a month, right? Like, what supplements am I going to take? What am I going to eat? How long am I going to eat beforehand to make sure that I'm safe, right? How are we getting home? Everyone's genuinely concerned about making sure that everyone's safe. Everyone is, included. Everyone is taken care of. And there's a general, just different feel there. I mean, it's completely polar opposite. And like you, I spent many years, 3 years, really going to clubs. And before I was 21. And the only clubs that allowed you to be under 21 and go were Providence, right? So I had to go from Boston to Providence, which is an hour drive. And so there were a lot of challenges that came into that, right? And then you'd be pounding beers in the car before you went in. And then generally the whole idea of being inside would be, hey, who's going to get me beers and have me chug them in a corner so no one can see, right? And it's just it's ridiculous, because at the end of the day, this is why prohibition never works and has never worked, right? You can look through the history of the entirety of human culture. Prohibition has never worked because it's basic psychology that to the degree you make something scarce is the degree you're going to make someone want it. Look at NFTs, for instance, right? They're graphics that are made on blockchain that really don't mean anything, but yet because they're scarce, everyone wants them, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this whole idea that if you think that the people that are in control are dumb, they're not dumb, right? They just don't care about you. And so at the same time, if you don't think they understand this basic tenet of psychology, right? We're talking about this on a podcast. If you think the people with billions of dollars don't understand this, it's just naivety at its finest.
Absolutely. A great example of that was when cannabis was legalized. And all the arguments, I remember writing papers on this in college. The biggest argument was increased use. If we legalize it, more people will use. It's like, cannabis is pretty easy to get already, even though it's illegal. And so we saw a minuscule increase in demand because everybody that was already smoking was smoking.
Yep.
And they just made it a little bit easier.
And you know what's funny about that? In a way, they actually made it harder, because back in the day, you'd have someone that would deliver to your house. And now, at least in Boston, the most revolutionary thing that they still haven't figured out is delivery, right? And I was talking about this with my buddy Devin, who actually has a delivery license that's going to be opening up here in Boston. And he's like, I'm really just going through all the hoops to make a legal thing of how the classic scenario with cannabis used to be, right? And what actually changed is that when things got legalized, a lot of times people that ran from cannabis their entire life, didn't inhale, the classic Bill Clinton type thing, are now running dispensaries, right? And so there's a comparison here, right? Because when cannabis was illegal, people that were going out and growing it were, and a lot of times, right, they were committed to that plant. Now, a lot of times they were just about money, right? I'm aware of that, right? But let me ask you this. How many people, especially when the industry is tailored to people that have $1 million in their bank account, are actually caring about that end product, right? And caring about the customer experience and caring that, their prices are so steep that people with cancer can't get their medication, right? Like all of these things are so challenging, right? And so the other funny thing I saw with cannabis is that, and I don't know who made this correlation. I don't know what drugs they were on. And I say drugs, not medicines, because I feel like someone would have to be on drugs to think this. If cannabis gets legalized, opiate use is going to go up. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Do you think that because people buy cars, they're going to immediately want to buy boats and drive their cars on water? Like, I don't understand what this correlation is, right? Because
the opposite happened.
Yeah, exactly. It did. And that was the funny thing, right? And they tried to, hide that for a long time. And, I give Weed Maps a lot of credit because Weed Maps started buying billboards and putting the stats on billboards, right? And they had the credentials there and the references. And so, and now, we're starting to notice ketamine being an assisted therapy that's available, right? Psilocybin being decriminalized in places. And I don't know about you, but I'm not hearing anything, even on the media, which is where I imagine I would hear this. They'd want to gloat this everywhere, that people are jumping out of windows, becoming insane, having to get, 21st century lobotomy, whatever that is. None of that's happening, right? You'd think if the people that would villainize this stuff because of the pharmaceutical industries, you'd think if this stuff would be happening, they'd be showcasing it, right? So where is it, right? Which is very interesting. Yeah.
What gives me the most hope now is that psilocybin is being used very effectively in treating PTSD in veterans. And I think that's a great in for psilocybin as far as American society.
Absolutely. You know why? Because it's very hard for anyone to say that veterans shouldn't be able to have anything that helps, right, at the end of the day. And so I agree with that. That's all the evidence you need. If people that, can see horrible, horrible things and going through some of the most challenging experiences that life has to offer, can get helped by, these therapies in a lot of ways, just microdosing too, right? We're not talking about macro doses of, having to go to a jungle and take time out of your life. We're talking about, very small doses of this medicine over consistent periods of time that can not only treat, but potentially cure PTSD. We're seeing, with MDMA assisted therapy, I forget the stats in the phase 3 trials, but there was a big substantial number of people that were cured from things like PTSD and depression, not treated, cured. Like they went in there with it and they came out without it. And that is not heard of in any pharmaceutical that's ever been created. And so what does that mean? That creates quite the contrary belief to what the propaganda has said. And I wish for everyone that is currently realizing this stuff to ask yourself, if the modern way that humans operate is how you do anything is how you do everything, well, then if a lot of the propaganda you've heard is falling apart at the wayside, what does it mean about the rest of it? What does it mean about everything you're hearing and intaking, right? And this is why, every once in a while, I'll be in a public place or something where the news will be on, and I'll hear 3 seconds, and I literally cackle to myself because it's just it's so silly, man, that I can't believe anyone could take anything on there as true. And at the same time, I have compassion because I understand, I can imagine where they're at, right? And I'm not going to say that I was necessarily ever far down that rabbit hole, but I definitely was affected by that at a certain point in my life, right? I was fortunate enough to interact with plant medicines early enough in my life that none of those patterns really got deep rooted. But I have a lot of compassion for those people because I understand that they're stuck in a fear state and their lower ego is putting them in a survival state where they literally think these things are going to ruin their life, right? And this is the challenge, right? And this is why I feel that these psychedelics and plant medicines can act as the perfect pattern interrupt. And again, right, it doesn't take someone ever actually having to have a hallucinogenic psychedelic experience, right? They could do a microdosing regimen where they never actually have to feel the effects of this medicine, like working on their cortex and all of these aspects of the brain, but they can still get the benefits. And I think that is so incredible because, again, we talked about alcohol, but let's talk about pharmaceutical ads for a second, right? It's ridiculous. They're having these ladies playing with their kids in the most artificially sunny day I've ever seen in my life, right? And they're going over the side effects that are a minute longer than the whole commercial of the benefits were. And it's just
sometimes worse than what you actually are treating.
in most cases, they're worse, right? It's like, hey, this could help with depression, but you might die, you might develop seizures, you might have Crohn's disease after. I mean, it's like, it's almost just ridiculous. Like it's literally, it feels like it would have been an idiocracy if it were 20 years ago, right? If you've seen that movie, which is, I think, one of the only movies that started out as a comedy and ended up a documentary, in a lot of ways. And, we could say that about The Matrix too, but, it's very interesting. And, one of the things I'm curious about for you is, what was like the first psychedelic experience you had where things shifted, right? And this could have been a microdose, could have been what some people call a macrodose, but what medicine was it? And like, what did that do for you in the totality of your life and being as a whole?
So my experience began in college, where I was smoking cannabis, and cannabis was giving me a heightened awareness in my body. I would work out with cannabis. I would do yoga with cannabis. And I was like, this feels really good. This increased awareness and this presence. And then my friends at the time were saying, and still my friends, hey, let's do some LSD. Let's go. Let's all try some LSD. I was living in a house in college, a single family home with 4 bedrooms. We had a pool, we had a yard. And so we said, okay, we're going to take this Saturday. We're locking the house down, nobody in, nobody out. And we're all going to drop 2 tabs of LSD. For my very first time was 2. So I jumped in the deep end, and I wasn't really sure how to swim, but I knew I could float. So we dove right in, and we dropped it around noon. I remember it being very early in the day because we wanted that length the entire day. And if you know anything about LSD, if you take 2 tabs, you're going to be in it for 10 hours, like 10, 11 hours. Exactly. Yeah. And it was recreational, though I enjoyed that we kind of kept it in that compound, right? It was 5 of us. We were all great friends, and nobody was coming in and out, and we're all dropping at the same time. So we were on the same journey, essentially. And of course, there were looking at the painting on the wall, and it just starts to swirl and melt, and the little characters in there start to move. And what was really bizarre was that since it was my house and I lived there, the things that I looked at every day started to look different. And that kind of played with my idea of reality initially. And I was like, is this real? Am I real? Though I remember in that experience being able to kind of sit over on the side when my friends were doing something else and start to drop in and be like, wow, like this feels like I feel really present. I feel very connected to everything around me, to the plants in the yard. And I feel my friends' energies in their voices and what they say and what they're experiencing. Maybe they're scared at the time. Maybe they were enamored by the painting, but just feeling that another plane of energy and interaction and frequencies was really, really incredible for me, and made me realize that there is more out there to perceive. There's more out there to explore. And it fed my curiosity. It felt like a roller coaster. I felt like I was strapped in, and I was like, holy shit, going up and going down. And 2 tabs of LSD is intense the first time. It bent my mind. And in a way that I almost thought I was like, I might go psychotic for a second. If anybody out there is thinking about trying it for the first time, I don't recommend to start with. Though on the come down, and as you know, when the come down kind of happens, you're way more chilled out. You're able to listen to some music and maybe watch a movie. That's kind of cool. And on the come down, we decided to watch the Marvel movie Doctor Strange. And if you've ever seen Doctor Strange, that is a trippy movie. And I don't like to use the word trippy that much, but it is a trippy movie where there's just fractals and other dimensions. And in the movie, there's a scene where the Sorcerer Supreme pushes Doctor Strange's astral body out of his physical body and then pulls it back in. And Doctor Strange goes, "What did you give me? LSD?" And I'm sitting there like, they know I'm on LSD.
This movie was made for me.
Exactly. Though in that movie, they introduced the concept of the mind healing the body, the mind programming the body to heal itself, using subtle energies, chakras, acupuncture, things like that to enact real physical change in the universe. And that like planted a seed in me, because at the time I wasn't into meditation. I wasn't into energy work. I wasn't into any of this, but that grew like a tree within me, because that was like, there is something more here. And that felt so true, right? It rung to my soul at the time. And that started my own personal exploration into psychedelics, which then delved into a little bit of mushrooms, but I think LSD was my first love, if you would say. And I still love the substance. I think it's very fun. I think it's very, very independent, whereas you can kind of choose your own adventure depending on the stimuli that you put around you and the kinds of thoughts that you're having. And it was amazing. Of course, that was recreational. And now dozens of journeys later with psilocybin, with LSD, with DMT, through ayahuasca, and even Wachuma, the San Pedro mescaline medicine, they've all been so powerful in my own personal growth in my journey. And they've always been timely as to what I've been present with. And I want to state this before I kind of give off the mic to you, is that a teacher of mine once said that psychedelics are not a lifestyle, they're an intervention.
Yes. I love that, man. And, it's funny, you and I share that same thing. LSD is one, molecule that I find people either genuinely hate it or love it. I love it. I think it's fantastic. And I didn't always, right? Like, I feel, for me anyway, like it takes me a couple of times to kind of like get the lay of the land. It's kind of like when you first go up on a snowboard, you don't know if you like it or not. But once you get a lesson, you're like, oh, now I know how to like work with this. And so the way that I always compare mushrooms and acid is that, mushrooms take you on an inner quest, while acid is an open world outside map, right? And so like to think about a video game, right? Like mushrooms kind of have like a track they're going to bring you on. They're going to take you and do what they want with you, right? And of course,
they have wisdom, right? They have consciousness.
Exactly. They have a consciousness. Whereas the molecules, and I actually had my buddy Dr. Nick Berry on. He illustrated this perfectly because he is a scientist and does a lot of work with different molecules and such. And so, he was saying that like, basically, just like you were saying, like the plants themselves, right? The things that are from nature have their own like consciousness and identity, but the molecules and the synthetic things, if you want to call it synthetic, it's kind of a weird term, but it is, from ergot fungus at the end of the day. So it is natural in a way, but syntheticized. But they kind of have like a choose your own adventure element to them, right? I mean, you can think about this with MDMA as well, right? Like has incredible opportunities to open your heart, or you can just go to a show and rage your ass off and not really, feel any of that. I mean, you'll be feeling it, but in a different way. It's different when, you take something like MDMA around a fire with some friends and you have like heart to hearts versus like going to see a show. Both sides are amazing in their own rights, right? But, it's like it kind of gives you a choose your own adventure versus if you eat 5 grams of mushrooms and you lay down, you're probably going to have a much better experience than if you eat 5 grams and try to go to a packed show, like absolute yikes. That would turn from an experience to an ordeal very quickly. And, because we were talking about the media and kind of like the, the dark side of propaganda, one of the things that I noticed, and I noticed this partly from taking psychedelics and watching things, right, was that, there's the other side too, right? Like movies like you were talking about with Doctor Strange, where it almost feels like there's another positive force out there who's like wrapping positive propaganda into movies, right? And telling people like, hey, you have more power than you think. Check out these things, right? What if this is true? What does that mean for your life, right? And one of the shows that I love that did this perfectly was Cobra Kai, right? And like I'm a Karate Kid fan, and one of the things that I noticed was after I was done watching that show, I had a mushroom experience, and I didn't watch the show while I was on mushrooms, but I thought about, because this show just moved me and it really like affected me in a positive way. Like even though it's a little violent and stuff, I left it feeling like, wow, that was really positive. Like I feel better about my life. And, whether or not you want to call this truth, it was my subjective experience, but I did a heroic dose of mushrooms and I asked the consciousness of mushrooms. I'm like, what's going on there? And they were like, don't you see, like Mr. Miyagi's energy is still flowing into this world through that show, right? And he's empowering people with the knowledge and his wisdom and the whole idea that, we are much more alike than we are different, right? And if you know the whole story, like Daniel and, Johnny, like they're the same person essentially, right? And they like hate each other, right? And then like, sorry if I'm spoiling it for anyone, but the last season they come together, and that's like the whole point of that show is to realize like, and throughout that show, you're having many little instances of that, right? But they're like the main characters that are like opposing forces, and they come together because love beats fear, right? Love beats the absence of fear, which is Kreese, right? And so, it was like, oh, that makes so much sense. And so then I really started realizing like, even music, right? Like there's a big, discussion going on right now about Astro World and that whole thing, right? And having gone to shows on psychedelics, I felt some really interesting, like absence of love vibes. Let's just call it that, right? From pretty calm music, right? Like nothing that like would tell you like, oh, like this is demonic or anything like that. And then I've gone to shows that are really like really heavy, but I feel love when I'm there. And again, you could easily say that's just you're having a subjective experience. Sure, absolutely. But it is a very interesting trend that I'm noticing with, the entertainment out there and things like this. Like you watch the news, right? And like TMZ is a perfect example. I was at my barber the other day and he had TMZ on, right? And they're not necessarily talking about negative stuff. They're not talking about anthrax in your water or anything like that. But I just get this like, this low vibe, like gossip nature type like vibe. And I just tune it out as much as I can. But then you might watch something like Cobra Kai, which has violence in it, right? Which has heavy metal music and things like that. And you get a love vibe, right? And again, subjective, but it's a very interesting correlation. And correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, but it's definitely a trend I'm noticing, at least in my own experience, where, it's not necessarily like, heavy metal music causes this and this causes that or whatever, but it's the vibrations put into it, right? And it's the same with podcasting or anything, right? Like, and what I notice is, a lot of these, shows that I watch, that give me this love vibe, whether or not they're like a, violent show or whatever, they have this element of spirituality in them, right? Like martial arts, for instance, is a very spiritual practice. And so, it's just a very interesting correlation I've been noticing. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts if you've noticed that with watching things like Doctor Strange versus watching the news, like that there's like an equal opposing force, if you want to call it a force, or equal opposing power, if you want to use David Hawkins' power versus force thing, that's like putting love into the mainstream to program people in the right way to hopefully allow them to pick up the ticket and take that ride into a more positive sense of being.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We see this with horror movies and stressful shows and things like that really trigger us. And for some reason, they're popular. People love watching scary movies, but I know that for my nervous system, it's no good. I had a session with a psychic woman from Peru, and she said, you're very sensitive. You don't need to be watching any of that stuff. You need to go watch like nice things and listen to like pretty music and all about nature and things like that. And so definitely. I mean, it's fascinating to see, the things that kind of become popular as well throughout culture, right? The beginning of the pandemic, we had Tiger King become popular, and we're like, what does that make you feel? Like, I don't know, people are watching all this stuff, and we have to be very discernful about what we put into our minds and our bodies, not just what we eat, but what we put into our brains. Someone goes to bring it back to the depression thing. Someone goes to a doctor, and I use this analogy all the time, and says, I'm depressed. My doctor says, it's because of the chemicals in your brain. They're all off. And they're like, okay, let's fix the chemicals. So it's like if I went to a doctor and I said, I got heartburn. And they said, yeah, because there's acid in your stomach. No shit. What did you eat before you got acid in your stomach? Like, What did you consume? Like mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. So we have to be discernible of what we consume and intentional about it as well. And, shows like Avatar, The Last Airbender, you see these things that are like, wow, that gives you hope that someone out there is making these things that are going to be beneficial for our consciousness. And I actually just signed up for Gaia, the subscriptions, the streaming service yesterday. And it was, if anybody out there doesn't know what Gaia is, look it up. It is like the ultra spiritual Netflix.
Dude, I was literally about to mention that before you said it. I was like, have you heard of Gaia? Because I started really taking accountability for this recently where, Rachel and I, like, there's times a week where, of course, like, no matter how conscious you are or whatever you want to call it, like, there's times you just want to relax, right? Like, I've had a long week and I just want to kick back and put my bed in zero gravity and watch something and be entertained, right? But I started noticing that, I calibrated myself to be entertained by things that were stressful, that were releasing cortisol, norepinephrine, these things, right? And so I took personal responsibility and realized that's not doing me any good, right? The times that I'm relaxing, I'm actually getting more stressed out. So I had actually signed up for Gaia a long time before, but never knew they had an app on the TV. So I was like going on the internet. It was super hard to like actually watch stuff. Dude, I downloaded that app and I have crushed, I'm talking seasons of like mystery teachings. That's what got me into the mystery schools. I watched that, felt a call from my soul, signed up and got my life activation 3 days later. Like these these things are so powerful. And the same way that, like, of course, there's a big emphasis, now everyone's aware that, hey, organic food is better than conventional food, right? But I think what we need to realize is how you do anything is how you do everything, right? What's the entertainment you're taking in? Of course, what are the people you're surrounding yourself with? What are you telling yourself about yourself? What stories are you telling yourself, right? So it's all of what we're intaking that can either be a positive or quote unquote negative, right? And so, really, like, what I love about bringing this home to plant medicines is that I think the best gift that plant medicines offer, that is the closest to what I would say is an objective truth as possible, is the overarching theme of awareness, right? They give you more awareness. Now, what they give you awareness on, yes, can be challenging, right? And you can look at that in two ways, right? I imagine the way you look at it is the same way I look at it now, where it's like, oh, thank goodness I realized that, because yeah, I've been feeling this block and I didn't know what it was. And so actually, like, the quote unquote challenging experiences are just as fun, if not more fun or enjoyable, than the quote unquote positive experiences, right? Because I don't know about you, but I love life. I'm happy pretty much all the time, right? But the times I'm not, I'm really curious about diving into that. I don't take psychedelics or interact with psychedelics or sit with psychedelics or medicines to get happier, right? Like, I don't do it like because my life is not happy, right? I do it because I'm curious about something. There's something I'm not seeing. There's something I want to become aware of, because ultimately whatever I'm not aware of is the exact thing I'm going to be able to help my clients with now, right? So because I can relate to that issue, I've gone through it myself. And so I think that's one of the best things to bring this all home of what psychedelics can really do in terms of gaining awareness, right? Like gaining awareness around all the things we talked about and gaining awareness around your own individual subjective experience of life and how that fits into the grand scheme of the objective reality we live in.
Amen, brother. Amen. And to kind of put an emphasis on this, you get the journey that you need, not necessarily the one that you want. Yeah. And whatever you need is exactly there for you. And it may be challenging, but there's no bad trips, just challenging ones, but you feel so much better after. Though I will say integration is really, really, really important, because what I've observed sometimes is a journey, especially on a powerful substance or a hero dose, can be very scary. And if you don't ground in that session and you leave, then you might leave dissociated or ungrounded, because fear, as we know, closes the root chakra. And if the root chakra is closed, everything else is closed.
Absolutely.
So that's why I firmly believe that, yes, the psychedelic experience, the journey is important. The integration after is even more important, because the psychedelic is just showing you the door. It's opening the door and saying, hey, do you want to walk through? And if you don't, you can take a step back, and that's okay. But there's a responsibility there. There's accountability that now you know better and you've seen better. And now it's probably in your mind that, like, oh, I could be doing things a little differently. Not out of guilt, not out of shame, but just of, hey, you're aware of this now. Now you have this responsibility
of self-love, right? Like,
absolutely,
realizing I can love myself better than this, right? Mm-hmm. And really what I love about what you said, and it's so pertinent and important, is that, we're interacting with a psychedelic that at most, if you're interacting with something like a boga, lasts 24 hours, right? But how often are we in our normal state of reality? I mean, endless hours, essentially, right? Our whole life. And so when we interact with a psychedelic, we are disintegrating, right? Like, we are literally dissociating, if you want to call it, becoming like part of the universe, right? The collective. And so if we don't figure out how to box that back up, aka what integration is, then at best, we're just going to be a little confused and then need another experience the next weekend, not because it's calling to us, but because, like, we need that feeling again. But at worst, you can have some very traumatizing experiences that leave you dissociated, right? And this is like why it's so important to go into things intentionally and have the right guides around someone like yourself that can actually hold the space and be able to, like, ask the right questions and, tailor the experience and make sure that everyone is safe. Because again, that's the biggest thing, within psychedelics, safety can be one of the core values, safely, right? Because, it's a really powerful area to get into. And so I love what you talked about, man. It's beautiful.
Absolutely. And for anybody out there that's thinking about trying this, the one thing I will say, and I think I said this yesterday when you asked me what's the one thing that you want to leave people with, is learn to breathe. And guess what? When you're in a journey in psychedelics, the breath is your steering wheel the whole time.
100%, man. And dude, this has been such an amazing flow. I want to make sure I give you ample time to drop where people can find you, what you're currently offering, how people can work with
Sure.
you, anything like that.
The one story that I did want to tell, we
Dude,
coming on
please.
here, the name of the podcast is One
Yes.
Time on Psychedelics. And I was like,
Yes.
okay, this is one that I love.
Yeah.
Is that as a guide, a medicine guide, you hear lots of stories about what people experienced or saw. And there was a time where I was guiding ayahuasca with a shaman. And I would hear people's stories like, I saw a black panther and then the jaguar came to me and the mother came to me and a spirit. And I have a friend, a great friend of mine she said, I met my star family and my family's from Sirius and I went to the planet and I visited them. And I was like, all right, I have not had any of these experiences. What is going on? Because I've been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
I'm always really grounded and lucid. And so the last ceremony that I participated in, one of my intentions, maybe unconsciously, but slightly conscious, is like, I want to see some stuff. I want to see some visions. And I drink the medicine. I'm sitting with it for about 30 minutes and I start to get a vision. And the vision is of that image. I don't know if you've ever seen this though, of the ocean off the coast of Alaska. And there's a piece of the ocean where the water's one color and then the other side is the water's another color. And they look distinct, though ultimately it's just the same ocean. And the idea that I got from that was the yin yang of life, the duality in the unity, because it looks different, but it's really just this, it's just water. And those two sides started to kind of dissipate into these smoke spirits. And I was like, oh boy, here we go. It's going to happen. We're going to see some stuff. And then the medicine goes, do you want me to keep going? We can keep playing this game if you want to.
Yeah.
But this is just for your mind to understand. Because you already know. And I was like, oh, you're right. You got me. You're right. No, we don't have to keep playing this game. Medicine was like, yeah, that's right. And at that moment, I felt like I was submerged into the river of life, into the flow. And I felt my body being carried forward. I guess if I just sat in the river and just flowing forward. And that moment of unity of consciousness, of just blissful awareness, is like, wow, this is what it's about. Like this is connection. This is connection to spirit. This is connection to the present. That's why we do the medicine. And that gave me a really powerful insight as to the medicine will show you what your mind needs to believe that it's having an experience like that. It will show you, it will say, look what you can see so that you can believe that there are things beyond our understanding, beyond our perception, and open that curiosity. What I got was that medicine was like, you already believe all this stuff, dude. So like, you know it.
Wow, dude, that's amazing, man. And it's so perfect too, because I'm someone also who like, I want to see visions, right? And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but really I've always been more rooted in my body during these experiences. And that makes perfect sense now. So thank you for allowing me to actually integrate and realize why I was having that while other people were having visions, right? Not that one's bad or good or anything like that, but just like, what's the most useful experience for what you already understand, right? You don't start on chapter 10 if you've already read through chapter 13, right? It's just like you get what you need, not necessarily what you want, right?
Absolutely. You got a world build, essentially. And one thing the shaman said to me was, there's going to be a point where your mind is going to want to keep understanding everything that's happening, but it's impossible with the kind of fire hose downloads that are happening in medicine for the mind, the logical reasoning mind, to comprehend everything. So just feel. I was like, whoa, sounds like he's talking to me.
Yeah.
I'm a Virgo, so I want to understand everything. And so that's a big step for me.
Yeah, dude. I mean, I see so many striking similarities between the two of us, and I'm really excited to meet you in person, man, because I feel like this adventure has only just begun, man. And I'm super
It's going to be a blast. Excited.
And yes. And dude, tell the people where they can find you, where they can get in touch with you, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. The best way to get in touch with me is through Instagram. I'm pretty responsive. You can find me at Salvatore Liberti _salva.live, and my website also www.salva.live.
Awesome, man. And, the trend with my podcast, I'm sure you imagine there was a last question coming. And so that question is this: if someone listening was just swayed by you to experience psychedelic medicines for the first time, what is the one piece of advice that Salvatore Liberti would suggest to allow them the smoothest experience possible?
Find a guide.
Dude.
Find a guide.
Yes. Hell yes.
I'm all about trailblazing and exploring, and Lord knows I've done it, and I did it last week. And though a guide is very, very valuable if you're curious about how to truly hold the space.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you want to go somewhere, you can take off in your car and, chance it, or you can use GPS. How many of you use GPS? I imagine most of you, right? That is your guide in the material realm. When you talk about driving, how you do anything to you, how you do everything, right? When you do something like a plant medicine, you want to have someone that can actually help you move through these things. It's extremely valuable. So I agree, man. And guys, when I was first curious about plant medicines, it was individuals like Sal who, even though the modern confines of society told me these medicines were useless and were overly dangerous, allowed me to realize that there was something much deeper than my mind calling me to them. As I embarked upon that journey, the mystical components of life exploded into my personal experience of life. And ever since, I have been more and more open-minded to the many mystical traditions and their teachings surrounding the subjects we spoke about today. The most beautiful thing about Sal and individuals like him is their ability to be the catalyst for those who are genuinely curious about these subjects, and allow them to not only have the direct experiences surrounding plant medicines and the inner work modalities that help us integrate them and understand ourselves at deeper levels, such as breath work and meditation, but also the gift of allowing these individuals to realize they are not quote unquote outcasts, but rather they are souls who are tapping back into the rituals and practices that have been practiced here on earth between humans, plants, and the nature around them since the dawn of time. For any of you who enjoyed the episode and are looking to dive in deeper with Sal and the work he does, give yourself the gift of reaching out to him to learn more about his group breathwork and meditation ceremonies he hosts both online and in person, and buy the ticket to take the ride into what is calling you from within. Speaking from personal experience, the calls from within are always the most fulfilling to answer. Sal, thank you so much once again for doing the work you do and for being an inspiration to my experience of life. And until next time, my brother, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.
Aho.